Okay, so we have this activity. You can read the instructions. I'll give them succinctly in just a minute as well, but I have a graphic organized for you. And if you have a piece of paper or, you can use your screen if you want to, and you can sketch, you can do bullet points, you can actually write narrative. And then that should be a tool for you to sort of process your past experiences and then be able to talk about them. Eventually, that's the end goal, is dialogue and sharing. But I'm going to give you an example of what this might look like by telling you a story of something that I've experienced, right? And if the graphic organizer doesn't make sense to you, or you want to try something different, that's fine as well. It's just a possible tool to use if it is helpful. But the idea is to take some notes about a disorienting dilemma that you have experienced. And if you can't think of anything for yourself, you could do something else, someone else that you have witnessed having a disorienting dilemma. And it can be a disorienting dilemma that caused any number of kinds of changes. So we've talked about kind of the what changes, anything like that qualifies. It can be a sudden shift or a long-term shift, anything like that. I think we're pretty open about what we're counting as a disorienting dilemma, as long as there's a positive direction of change, and that something fundamental, something deep in the self has shifted. And the idea here is to explicitly as possible lay out not just the disorienting dilemma, but also the before and the after. So here's what the graphic that I made looks like. And so you've got these three bigger points of who you were raised to be, and then this disorienting dilemma, and then who you are now. And you can enter into this at any point. So you can start with this disorienting dilemma if that's helpful to try to remember a moment. You can start by thinking about who you were raised to be and how that doesn't feel like you anymore, and move from there. You can begin here and think, who am I now? And then contrast that with earlier, and then try to come to the disorienting dilemma between. But the point is to try to use those big three circles and the contrast between them to get into the finer detail of the smaller circles. So the who you were raised to be includes a lot of assumptions that you made about other people, about the world around you, about yourself, your emotional sort of visceral gut reactions to things that were, pretty much unexamined, and your habitual behaviors that when you're on autopilot, you just were, because that's who society and your family and your peers kind of trained you into being. And then on this side, on the who you are now side, between the disorienting dilemma and you as you are now, we can highlight some of the things that you reflected on, some of the intentional actions that you took to sort of change the ways that you interact with yourself and other people in the larger world. So here's your graphic. I'm going to go back to the instructions one more time just so you can see. When you actually go to make your notes, you can do that in any form, and then basically be prepared to talk about it. So let me flip through here again, and I'll give you an example. Here's a sample narrative. So my first trip to China, I was preparing to do a study abroad trip. And so I was there for about 2 weeks, kind of doing some exploration, some collaboration with some colleagues, trying to figure out the logistics of a study abroad trip. Also just doing a little bit of sightseeing and kind of learning the environment and getting a very, very simplistic crash course in the Chinese language, which I had never been exposed to at all before. So this disorienting dilemma happened when I was on the plane coming back from China. And I was on Korean Air, which is important to the story because part of my military experience, growing up in the military that I mentioned earlier, almost 3 years when I was younger, I was living in South Korea. So the moment happened when at the beginning of the flight, the flight attendants say their spiel in Chinese and then in Korean, because it's Korean Air, right? And in that moment, when they switched languages from Chinese to Korean, I noticed my body go from the state of like angst and feeling like tense and to like complete sigh, relaxation. And it's not even that I understood everything that was said because I'm not fluent in Korean, but even just the sound of the language. And I heard the thoughts, the internal monologue in my head. I heard myself thinking, oh, that sounds so beautiful. How relaxing. Oh, how melodious is the Korean language. It's just so beautiful. What a relief it is to hear Korean after these couple of weeks of all this discordant sounds that I've been dealing with, and this strident tone of voice and all this. It was the same person speaking the Chinese and the Korean over the loudspeaker, right? But my emotional, my physical reaction to that, and then the thoughts going through my head was a really stark contrast of like Chinese bad, Korean good, right? And I had this moment as an interculturalist of like, what the heck is going on with me? And so I spent like 3 hours on that flight just ruminating and thinking through what was going on and thinking back through all those experiences that I had just had in China. For example, I was in this marketplace and just caught myself, not in the moment, but on the plane later, caught myself totally expecting and thinking that everything there would be really cheap, and not just cheap in price, but like poorly made. And um, experiencing um, Chinese people talking as too loud, as, like sort of wishing that they would just be quiet. Like really, really judgmental and horrible thoughts. And so part of my reflection process in response to this disoriented dilemma of trying to figure out, what was going on in my head and in response to the change in languages, I came to realize and think through how as a child I had not only been absorbing stereotypes and prejudices against Chinese culture from my native US perspective, but from Koreans as well. Because at least the way that I experienced Korea, there's a lot of angst, historically, between Korea and Japan, Korea and China. And there's lots of perceptions of, made in Korea, awesome, made in China, oh, probably not worth anything, right? So it put me into this place of being hyper aware of what I had learned as a child about this other culture that was totally below the surface then. And so from that point on, every time something comes out of my mouth about the Chinese, I have this sort of self-check. Like, I had never thought about it before, but in the South, where, my mom is from and I've spent a number of years, there's this horrible saying that people say that like when things go really badly, or your plan doesn't work out or whatever, people say, oh, it fell apart like a Chinese bicycle. Like, right? So now I hear these things coming out of people's mouths, and heaven forbid my own mouth sometimes. And it takes me back to that moment on the plane. And then it takes me back to experiences that I had in China. And it's all wrapped up in this past, present, future timeline of now sensitivity to that and hyper awareness of how those stereotypes and prejudices that I was raised with, take constant attention so that I'm not replicating them and having them come out in my behaviors and in the ways that I'm treating other people and talking about other people and those kind of things. So quick example. So spend a couple of minutes making some notes. Doesn't have to be totally life-changing. Can be smaller like that example. It can be something much broader, like Laura was talking about, this 18-year span and what a different person, any clarity, that you can show on a graphic like this about who you are now and who you were raised to be. And, even if you can't pinpoint the very specific moment of the disorienting dilemma, but what kinds of things can you fill into the graphic that provide you some insight? So I'll give you a little bit of silence to do that for a few minutes, and then we'll talk through it a little bit.